here's my question to you, Bruno. You said something very interesting about tax, and then I said, can I please just say, tell our viewers something exciting about tax, and then I'm just going to sit back and learn something.
Sure. So it's a very quick one. I got asked it this week on one of the YouTube channels. So a lot of people trying to find a shortcut, and this was actually something that came into play quite a few years ago, where if I own a residential property and I want to transfer the residential property to you, transfer duty is payable. So it's quite basic. You take the value of the property, and there's a simple calculation. You look at the specific rates and you go, oh, X 13% is payable on the value of the property. So a transfer duty is a relatively simple concept to understand. But then obviously, as we do, then we started trying to get smart with it. And we said, well, what if the company or the trust holds the property? And instead of selling the property on which transfer duty is payable, why don't we just sell the shares? And then transfer duty won't be payable, right? So a number of years back, SARS obviously caught on to this. So you're not the person who asked the question, you're not the first one to think about it. In fact, they've thought about it, they've used it, and SARS has put an end to it. So we are at that point, unfortunately, where it can't be done anymore. So that kind of answers the question. Can it be done? No, it can't. What are the consequences? I think that's a bit more pertinent. So if I generally choose from a commercial perspective to sell the company to Cilna as opposed to transferring the property, first of all, why would I do that? It happens all the time. If I own, let's say, 4 properties sitting in my company and Cilna wants them all, if she goes and buys each individual property from me, she needs to pay conveyances, she needs to pay a whole range of different things, and it starts becoming very difficult. Whereas a share transfer is a lot easier. So I can transfer the shares to Cilna without having to go through a conveyancer. So that's great news for me, or great news for Cilna rather, because she saves on all those costs. So there are really good reasons why you'd want to sell the entire portfolio under a company as opposed to selling it outside of the company simply as assets. And even with one property, sometimes it does make sense if you're so inclined. But that doesn't mean that you're going to save on everything. So there's still a capital gains component to it, because as much as properties increase in value, so do the shares of the company that owns the property. I mean, it's simple mathematics if you think about it. A share's worth the assets found in the company. So if the value of the assets increase, so does the value of the shares. So you'd be in for capital gains if there was appreciation. So that you're not going to save either way, right? There are a few little tax tricks, but we're not going to get into it right now because those start getting a bit complex on how you might want to move shares and get involved in a company. But then technically you'd be taking over. It's called an asset for share swap, but we'll deal with that later. So on a simple sale, Bruno to Cilna. So transfer duty, SARS said, listen, if you're transferring shares in a company that's basically called a residential property company, right? What that means is it owns residential properties. If the shares, or rather the assets in the company, are predominantly residential property. So it's a company that owns predominantly residential property. In those instances, SARS will still charge you transfer duty on the transfer of shares. So just expect it. You'd be saving on transfer costs, but not transfer duty.
That's actually very clever, and I've had quite a few people wanting to do things like that, and I always say to my clients, remember, if you think of something and you think, oh my goodness, this is a fantastic way of not paying tax, I can promise you, SARS thought about it as well, and you will pay tax when you sell property, whether you pay VAT, whether you pay transfer duty. That could be and it could be, I mean, in a going concern, a 0-rated VAT transaction. But tax is tax. Even if it's a 0-rated VAT transaction, it remains tax. So know that when you buy and sell property, there will be tax payable. I mean, you can't buy bread without paying a form of tax. So the taxes are part of life, as some injuries in life is. It's it's what it is. And if you get overly creative with tax, there's obviously a risk of being stuck wearing orange for a long time.
And it's actually quite the funny thing, because you've got different tiers of how people deal with tax. And I think it's very crucial, like especially as a tax practitioner, to go understand what you're doing. So you have people that use these mechanisms and these arrangements to avoid tax, but at all costs. And it is dodgy. It's actually a reportable arrangement. And
Yes.
the problem is that once you start getting to the point where you're paying zero tax, something's wrong. Be very careful, because it probably isn't right. It doesn't sound right. And if it seems like a fishy transaction where money's going through here, passing through that guy who you have no relationship with, and now you're getting money back, but it's tax-free, be careful, right?
Yes.
But then you've got the second guy. Now, jump to the third guy. The third guy just pays tax and doesn't ask any questions. This guy in the middle is kind of sitting in the right place, because like our job isn't to say evade tax effectively. Our job is to say there's a way of structuring it. So even the advice that I gave now, how do you save costs? And there's the answer. Do you transfer the asset directly? Maybe not, because you want to save a bit of bucks here, transfer the shares in the company. That's completely legitimate. It's good advice to structure yourself to pay the minimum amount of tax possible, but legitimately so. And there's risks associated with that as well. So if I say just transfer the shares in the property, plenty of risk, because then what if the company's in debt? What if the company signed as a surety for somebody else and you don't know about it? So there's risks with that as well. But that's the weighing up of, and that's what lawyers do. You assume certain risks, you assume certain cost savings, and you try and mitigate it. But yeah, exactly to Cilna's point, like you can either land up in jail, or you can land up paying a lot of tax, or you can just play in the middle where you're smart about how you do things to avoid paying as much tax as you would normally.
Exactly. And don't Google tax advice. Call the right people.
Yeah, exactly.